I will have what is without a doubt the ugliest pair of footwear at the Viking Pulse Raid this year. But I made my own all leather turn shoes, boots, turn boots, something like that, yeah. So I started this off with a pattern, since, well, that's usually how things like this start. I didn't have a sock big enough to go over the shoe, so wrapped everything in saran wrap and then gave it a couple layers of duct tape. Traced the edge of the sole. Actually, I gave myself a little bit of room for seam allowance. It turns out I didn't need it, but I did it anyways. And then cut the sole out of the bottom of the shoe and then pulled the saran wrap over top of the shoe. So I was pretty sure that the duct tape sole was going to be way too big. Turns out I was right. Turns out this one was too. But anyways, traced a pattern on my foot and then followed a couple of different tutorials for this. Made a bunch of different measurements that I ended up not using so much. Once I had everything measured, I put a little triangle in the back of the sole because lots of tutorials recommended that. Apparently it does something to strengthen the turn boots. Squared out the toes and cleaned up the pattern as best I could by smoothing out the lines. Next, I cut the pattern out and traced two soles in proper orientations, make sure you think that one through, onto a heavyweight piece of 8 or 9 ounce leather. Then I cut the duct tape patterns apart and laid them out as flat as I could get them so I could trace them on paper. And it turns out I wasn't able to get the toe area flat, so I just made one of them with a cut so that I could take a little bit of material out so the pattern would lay flat. Then finished squaring everything up, put the little triangles in there for the heel, and started taking measurements for how tall I was going to get the boots to be. And I made these so that they were about 11 inches from the top of the heel. And here's where I pretty much had to start making everything up because I couldn't find a good tutorial or pattern for boots that were as tall and wrapped the way I wanted them. So I measured up my leg of 11 to 12 inches and then I measured around my calf so it would give me an idea how wide I was going to need these things to be. And then from there, I just sort of took a paper pattern and wrapped it around my leg until I found the appropriate overlap that I needed, and that's that great big piece with the funky flap that you see there on the leather. Traced the pattern out onto a nice, soft, supple deerskin and started stitching everything together. This is actually what took a long time. Once I had the toe stitched on, I went through and I punched the uppers completely through and then used the same punch to mark the sole where I was going to go, so I had the holes at the right interval, and then went through and used an awl to push it between the layers of the leather. You don't want this thing to go all the way through to the bottom. You need it to come out at the side for it to work. Getting started was the hardest part. I laid the thing flat, pushed the needle through from the bottom of the sole to the edge, and then put the upper on. And once I had the upper in place, made a couple of stitches. I overlapped the first stitch twice to make sure that it was nice and tight. Once I had everything in place, I was able to put it in the stitching pony, and that made things a lot easier. From there, it's just repetitive stitching, stitching, stitching. I punched the other outer and then went through the same process, overlapped the toe with the first hole so that there'd be room to whip stitch the top seam that goes across the top of the foot. Okay, so helpful lesson 101. One of the things that I discovered while I was working on this is when you're putting these things together, before you actually pull any single thread tight, make sure you leave yourself some slack, because if you try and whip or saddle stitch properly, you're supposed to pull the thread from the back side of the leather to make sure you haven't pierced it. If you get too far ahead of yourself and you actually pierce one of these threads, you'll either A, break the thread, or B, you won't be able to get the thing to pull tight enough to actually hold everything together. So while you're getting started in particular, go real slow to make sure that you don't pierce the thread. Just leave yourself a little slack on the back, and as you're pushing the needle through, pull it from the other side. Pull the string from the other side. Once I had the soles and the uppers completely joined together, I whip stitched the top piece. This is a piece that goes from the toe to the top of the foot. I whip stitched it together, double whip stitched, and I went probably, I don't know, 3/4 of the way up and then tied it off because I was afraid if I went up too far, I wouldn't be able to turn the shoe inside out. And I still went a little further than I should have, but I was able to get it turned off with some fighting, as you'll see. Many of the tutorials actually wet the soles down to make them easier to turn. I did not, and this is where the turn shoe, gets its name. You sew it inside out, and then you turn it the other way. I started at the back and folded the edges over the heel, and then worked my way down the boot along the side. And I actually left this long, although I put it in fast forward to show you that it can be a little bit tough, but it can be done. From there, I just used my fingers to push the toes out until I had it laying roughly where it needed to be. Most turn shoe tutorials that I've seen were kind of low-cut shoes, and because I was making boots, I knew that I was going to need the extra room to turn it. So once I had it turned, I then went through and sort of modified, double whip stitched the rest of the toe and arch into place. Stitched it all the way to the flap, tied it off a couple of times. Every couple stitches, I'd make a couple stitches, tie it off, make a couple stitches, tie it off. That way, if something happens to one of these breaks, the shoe doesn't come apart. I then moved to the back of the shoe and did the same thing with a sort of modified double whip stitch, and started at the heel and worked my way all the way up. And once I was able to turn the boot far enough inside out that I could just sew it from the rough side of the leather, it made things a lot easier and a lot faster. This is what that double whip stitch will look like on the inside. Notice the crisscrosses where I'd alternate holes. Just felt like it would give it a little bit more durability. And from here, it was all downhill. Good coat of Phoebing's oil dye, a custom dark brown or darker brown color. All I had was black and medium brown, so I made it a little darker than I wanted it to be and gave it a couple of good coats. Tried to leave it a little splotchy, but smooth it out as best I could. Then coated it with carnauba cream and then buffed it so that it's not real shiny, but it looks like something that's a little worn and waterproofed. I measured around my ankle and then at the top of my calf to get an idea of how long I needed the straps to be, then cut those out of some 3 or 4 ounce lightweight leather that I had. And then once again with the coat of dye and coat of carnauba and a little bit of buffing, and I punched them and sewed them on. It's interesting to see how the different types of leather take dye different color. I mean, it's the exact same bottle of dye, but they're just a little different, and it's because of the different types of leather. Once I had the straps attached, I put the boots on and wrapped the things around to get an idea of where I needed the hole for the fasteners to be. Then I 3D printed these little toggle closure thingies and put them on with some really heavy sinew that I had. Just doubled it over and tied it around on the backside, and all I do is just wrap the strap around. It's got a little hole in the end and push those things through. I learned a lot making these. I had a good time. This is actually the second pair of footwear I've ever tried to make. Way back when I first started leatherworking, I made my wife a pair of moccasin style things, fairly low cut, but I wanted a pair of boots and I couldn't really find a pattern or a tutorial out there, so I just sort of made it up as I was going along, and they're ugly, they're reasonably comfortable, but they'll suffice. I hope. Have a great day.